Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. I'm delighted to welcome three guests onto the podcast for this week's episode. So we have got Connor Derbidge, we've got Rob Lee and Andrew Whittington. So thank you very much, lads, for coming on. We are going to focus on this episode around pre-season. So I ask the audience a lot about topics, about people that they want to come on to the podcast. Pre-season always comes up. So we're going to delve into that in a little bit. But first of all, before we do that, let's go into some backgrounds. So what we'll do, just a brief background on yourself, clubs you've been at, the roles you've been in, and just take us up to your current role as well. And Connor, do you want to just kick us off, mate?
Yeah, all right, Ben. So basically, I started off as an intern under Rob at Cardiff. Was an intern for about a season and a half, and then Rob left to where he is now at Doncaster, and I took over from him. I did that for a season and a half, working quite closely with Wits in the academy with the 23s. And then from the end of that season, I got a chance to work at Exeter with the first team. That was in 2019. And I've been there ever since. So coming up to my third season now with them. And that's pretty much it. So quite early in my strength and conditioning profession. But enjoying it.
Real. And your current role is your first team S&C?
Yeah, first team S&C, yeah.
Awesome. Rob, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Ben, thanks for having me on. Cheers, Connor, for a little introduction there, mate. So it started for me when I was at university. So my last year at uni, I did an undergrad in sports and exercise rehab. And in my last year, I did a placement at Leyton Orient Football Club. So when I was there, I was doing bits and pieces for the physio, so a bit of massage, was doing some mid-stage rehabilitation, helping out a little bit on the pitch. And that eventually led me to going on to the under-18s. So I stayed on the next season, did my Masters at the same uni at Middlesex. And then, did my Masters, started to work with the under-18s then. That led to a paid role. And then after I finished my Masters, I had a season there as head of Academy Sports Science. A bit of a torrid time. It was not that, I'm not sure there's too many Leyton Orient fans that listen, but they got taken over by an Italian guy, and the club just went downhill. We ended up getting relegated from League One. But towards the end of the season, I was working with the first team as like the S&C coach, helping out with a bit of sports science. From there, went to Cardiff as under 23 strength and conditioning coach. And that was because the manager at the time of when I first went into Leyton Orient, the manager, Russell Slade, went over to Cardiff, and he took his fitness coach, Lee Sunwood, over to Cardiff to work with the first team. Opportunity come up to get work with under 23s at Cardiff, so I went over there. I was there for 3 seasons, and then typical how you get a job in football, the physio who I used to work with at Leyton Orient got the job at Doncaster, the opportunity to come up to head of sports science role. So went there in 2017, and I've been there ever since.
And Which, do you want to round it up, mate?
Yeah, there seems to be a theme of these boys leaving Cardiff, and I'm still there, so I'm not sure what. Yeah, so similar sort of thing, normal sort of thing you'd expect, undergrad, postgrad at Cardiff Met. Finished there in 2013, and I did a sort of a full-time over a year internship at Cardiff City within the academy, so working with predominantly the 16s and 18s. And then sort of right place, right time. At the end of that season, there was a position available as a lead academy sports scientist. So working with the 18s predominantly, but also looking at helping with the other age groups as well. So that would have been 13, 14 season. So a decent amount of time ago. And so obviously I've sort of jumped from some different roles within the club. So overseeing 9s to 18 sports science provision as head of academy sports science, and then obviously bumping up to look at overseeing 9s to 23s and probably working a little bit more closely with the first team. Over the last sort of 18 months to 2 years, I've sort of jumped from a sort of dual role with coaching as well. So I was assistant 18s coach as well as head of elite performance. And now predominantly this season onwards, I'm sort of reverting back to the performance role itself and not the dual role. So most of the time, obviously all the time spent at Cardiff, but a little bit of a difference in background with a mixture between the sports science S&C and obviously the technical coaching as well.
Perfect. Cheers, lads. Well, I'm hoping this podcast is at a decent time for people, because it's tackling the topic of pre-season. I know a lot of clubs are going to be going in as this goes out basically from next week or the week after. So we've got a few areas we want to sort of cover, and then we've also got some questions that have been sent in as well that I haven't given you the heads up on, so I'm going to throw them at you in a little bit as well, see what we can get. But just to start with, I thought we'd start with the importance of pre-season and just to get your views on it, because obviously looking at the whole season, essentially, and we'll get into the length of pre-season in a little bit, we might have a 6-week period, an 8-week period. I know this year's been whatever we could get basically, but in terms of importance throughout the whole season, where do you rate it? Do you think it's a really important stage of the season where you've got to nail it, or is it just a few weeks where you've got to get through? Like, how important do you rate it? Which, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe my position probably differs to the lads a little bit in terms of our development probably carries across the season a little bit more. Whereas maybe the lads might build that in that window of opportunity, maybe from a physical development within the pre-season, maybe in the first environment, is really crucial, because when they get into an in-season period, Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday is quite relentless to try and build a solid foundation of whatever it was going to be. But I think but on the flip side, in both environments, I think it's really, really important, because you're able to sort of build a real good, solid foundation to make sure that athletes are robust, ready to tolerate whatever's going to come at them in the in-season. So I think in terms of the importance of it, I think it is important. I think getting it wrong, it can have massive sort of repercussions, even at developmental level. So for example, one of the slides I might present this week or next week to our sort of players and our staff is the importance of sort of surviving the pre-season. And if you can stay robust and hit those sessions off, tick them off, your availability will be so much better throughout the season. Whereas if you pick up a little niggle or injury within the first few weeks, the boys may have experience of this. You generally get on that wheel where you're going to get in that rehab cycle. You don't get that chance to build that load back up again once the games start to come. So that importance of this first block of work is, I think, to me, is crucial for development as much as it is performance. Because if you're an under 18 scholar, if you end up missing 6 to 7 months of your scholarship or apprenticeship, as a big chunk of your time, which you could be progressing and developing.
Perfect. Rob, do you want to add anything to that?
I completely agree, really, to be honest. I mean, you think the time we get to build physical capacities in season, like Which just alluded to there, is small. Especially, probably not so much this season coming, but last season was ridiculous. So making the players, or getting the players fitter for what we want them to be, is very, very crucial within that pre-season period, because there's no time in season to do it. There's loads of studies. I won't quote studies, but you look at some studies about, availability in season and injuries within season. Essentially, if you have more pre-season training sessions and you're not injured, your injury likelihood in season is going to be lower. So I think for that robustness, it's very, very crucial, really.
Connor, do you want to disagree? Or
Fortunately, I can't add much more to this. No, like I said, just from my experiences, any player that's not made it in a pre-season for one reason or another, whether that's out for a week, 2 weeks, they always seem to have a little niggle in season. Just from my experiences now, and vice versa, players who've got through pre-seasons have then gone on to play the full amount of games, high minute players. Now, whether that is just their innate self or whether being able to build that load in pre-season is what's caused it. But like Wits alluded to, I think building the base, that's what pre-season allows you to do, allows you to build that like chronic load that you can then work on, and you can do more in season with that. You've got a bit more freedom. So that's why I think it's so important to that is why the pre-season period is so important.
Yeah, I think you get, sorry to butt in,
Sorry.
but you get like, I speak to some players who come to us and they tell me the pre-season they've done, and you think, wow, like how have you got through the season doing that? But sometimes towards the end of the season, those teams come on stronger. Not naming names, and you don't know whether they're telling the truth or they're speaking ill of the club they've been at. But you're thinking, how have they got through the season if they've done that in pre-season? But yeah, I mean, this is trying to like play devil's advocate a little bit, but I think essentially football is about having better players, really. But I think you've got to give them that base, really, for them to build on throughout the season.
It's the time in the season, isn't it, that it's like we get these little snapshots, and coaches or people looking from the outside jump on any little thing that they can get, don't they? And don't know the full picture a lot of the time. And it's a really hard one, isn't it? Because I completely agree. I think it's an important time, but we only get little snapshots, and you see it all the time on social media in particular, don't you? Where a team will be seen doing something. The coaches might have a certain objective they're trying to get out of that. Like it might not be anything to do with in terms of creating anything to do with fitness. It might be just a team bonding session or something, and people jump on it and they're all over it straight away. So it's a hard one, isn't it? Because we like I say, we only get snapshots a lot of the time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's not, obviously, from our perspective, maybe not so much for Wits a little bit, but we're all about building physical capacities. That's what we're here for. That's what we're paid to do, and helping the coaches get the players fit to do what they want to do with them. But it's not just about that. And some of the things that people do build mental robustness, do make the players think, you know, when I'm tired towards the end of the game, yes, I've got the capacities to do it, but I can push myself a little bit further because I've done these stupid forest runs that the managers made me do, or run up and down this hill 20 times, you know, that sort of thing, really. So you got to look at the context, as you said, Ben. You got to look at the context. You don't know where. You look at snapshots. You've got to look at the context around it and why people are doing it, really.
Anything else to add to that, lads?
I think that's all good from me.
Bro, well, what we'll go on to next are the main objectives of a pre-season period from your point of view. So I know obviously technical coaches, the manager might have certain objectives they're trying to hit. Physios they're going to have objectives they're trying to hit. But from your point of view, in your role working with the players that you work at, what are some of the main objectives that you're trying to hit across that period? And Which, do you want to start with you?
Yeah. I think the objectives for me personally, I think they start in the programming for the off season. So when you have those meetings with your players and you decide sort of the structure of what you would like them to do and adhere to, I think your outcomes for your pre-season sort of start there, because if they're good and they're good adherence and they really nail the programs in terms of maybe keeping that decent level of aerobic capacity and keeping themselves relatively robust from a running perspective, because it's not the be all and end all in that period. They still need to rest and regenerate. Especially I'm thinking more from a gym-based perspective. So if they keep that chronic loading of, I don't know, with our situation is, I don't know, can they build strength? Can it build hypertrophy in that block? So when they come back in as an objective is almost keep that going. So we're not just like parking things and then we're having to sort of restart everything. Hopefully the most professional athletes would ensure they got that level of capacity to be able to hit the ground running that first week. So I think from my perspective, looking at maybe week 1 or week 2 is almost that safe progression into everything again. So whether that's changing direction, accelerating, decelerating, progressive high speed, ball striking, finishing, having bodies in around you, some more sort of cognitively demanding situations rather than you program on your own with a ball and a pitch and single running. So I think those sorts of objectives are clear when I try and plan stuff in terms of clearly sort of objectifying and ticking those things off quite early to sort of get into a readiness state that they're sort of handed to the technical staff in line with the fitness staff at as early stage as possible to say, great, they can sort of do everything. They can change direction. They can ball strike over various and distances. They can high speed. They've progressed up to exposures to sprinting. Those sorts of key objectives for me are really key over the first sort of maybe 4 to 7 sessions, and then giving them a little bit of progressive load leading into that first maybe competitive game minutes then. So yeah, and that would be the same for the off-pitch stuff as well, potentially, is obviously you're trying to build and progress that load as well, safely, because you've got that concurrent effect going on of pitch, gym, recovery, decreased sleep levels because they're waking up at a different time now because they're back into a structure, whatever it would be. So I think that's really key, is obviously trying to really integrate those things all back in together safely, and not spike anything at a different time then. So I think that those are those key sort of objectives for me, really, is of building in those first few weeks are really crucial.
Connor, do you want to add to that, mate, in terms of your objectives?
Yeah, so interestingly, probably how I would differ mine to Whit. So by the end of the pre-season, I want players to be prepared for multiple matches, both physically but also tactically. So how I kind of look at it is going backwards from there. So I want them to at least get 90 minutes in throughout the pre-season. So that's one of my objectives. I want players, that's what I tell the coaches, we need to build our match minutes. So every player in the team has got 90 minutes under their belt. And then obviously throughout the whole pre-season period, you want them to stay injury-free. So that allows the tactical element. So they're there for every training. They can build that non-verbal communication that often a lot of coaches talk about. So that's kind of how I break it down. That's like my big goal. And then from then I break it down to like Wits is saying. So then I look at, okay, so based on the 2 years, I've now got a good idea of the first week of in-season, what type of load that looks like. And then each week from then I just build backwards. So I know what my first week and second week kind of look like. Yeah, and then it's other small goals. So you want to make sure every player's been exposed to a max sprint in a controlled environment before they go into a game, and work into your worst case scenarios. So whether that's through repeated sprint training or whether that is in how the coaches want to do it, sort of tactics. So I kind of, work backwards from it. Just doing it that way, really.
Do you want to add to that, Rob, and put your objectives if there's anything different to the lads? Or
similar to lads. I think obviously it's easy for me to listen to them two talk and think a bit more philosophical, but I think when you first start thinking about pre-season training and planning it, you get a bit overwhelmed. You think, I've got all these components to fit in and there's everything everywhere. I've got to do everything. Realistically, all you're doing is a progressive overloaded program for X amount of weeks. That's all it is. So I like to just do an overview of this is what I'm doing for this block, this is what I'm doing for this block, this is what I'm doing for this block, and then start to break it down, really. So essentially that's how I think. And realistically, what we're trying to do is build physical capacities for players to execute the tactical roles that the manager wants. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure the players can do what the manager wants them to do. That's why we're here. And then you're looking to not just do that on a single game, not the demands of a single game, but multiple games, like Connor said just there. And we're just trying to build them to that and then just work backwards. So reverse engineer back from that. And essentially that's it. Progressively overload the neuromuscular, like Whit said, and then work backwards from the game demands, how many game demands you need to condition them to, and work back from that to day one, week one.
Because the fact is now as well that as a broad statement, we're not, and I feel like we should have got someone else on from a different era, because none of you are old enough to worked with players that were from an era of them turning up and being completely out of shape and that sort of thing. But essentially now, players are coming back in good condition, aren't they? They're coming back, and they've generally, as a general statement, they've done stuff through the off season. They've kept themselves in good condition. I know Connor was talking just before we started recording, saying they've had lads in working throughout this time as well. So it's taking them where they're at, isn't it? Which is going to be very different to maybe 10 years ago or however long back we go in terms of players turning up completely out of shape. And the pre-season was then literally first few sessions is a case of dusting those cobwebs off completely, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think with like technology nowadays as well, with like the Map My Run, Strava, it's definitely made pre-season planning a lot easier. I've got a great idea of where certain players are at now, whereas perhaps before you were uncertain. And it has kind of affected, if I'm going to give a little bit away, it's kind of affected how I'm planning my first week of pre-season. So last pre-season, we had a lot of the core squad, a lot of players stayed and they followed the program well and knew exactly what they were doing. This season, I've not had as many people send in their sessions through. So I was planning to do some sprint testing on the second day back, because in the program, a lot of the work players are exposed to max sprinting, so it wouldn't be a problem. However, because I've not had a few back, I've kind of taken my foot off the gas a bit and rescheduled it for another time, purely based on the fact that I've now got evidence that players have done or haven't done something. Likewise, last season, I probably was able to accelerate my pre-season based on the fact that I knew they did the work through their recorded sessions.
Anyone want to jump in on that? Sorry, Wits.
I think I'm probably jumping back into a little bit what Rob said around the objectives. Really, when I'm thinking about what I said and reflecting on what the boys had said, is I think it's got to match to what the technical staff or the multidisciplinary team wants, because it's pointless really having my own objectives if they don't match with the other stuff around. We could have a perfect plan on paper that looks like all whistles in 6 weeks and it's really perfect, but you might put it on a screen in front of the rest of the staff. They're like, oh, actually, no, that's changed now. We're off on that day. We're in on it. We're doing this now. And you're like, unless you that relationship and the communication with whoever is the key stakeholders, whether that's the manager, first team coach, assistant coach, in our sort of environment, whether that's head of medical, head of coaching, carrying manager, the PDP coaches, I think it has to be clearly planned alongside each other to sort of know, like what Rob was saying around our technical, tactical demands, when are they planning to integrate certain things? So we might be like, I don't know, when are we trying to look at out of possession pressing principles? So what day are we going to try and start to do that? And how can that affect what we do from a physical perspective? So we probably make sure we tick those things off before they go into that session, or make sure that we try and integrate it as best as we can. So I think it's key that straight away that relationship and the communication is there, so it's delivered from an integrated fashion rather than the sports science or the S&C is perfectly happy because they got a great plan on their laptop, but it actually doesn't flow like that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
To be honest with you, that's what I was trying to get at. Is I've just given an overview of, obviously, we need to build physical capacities. Everybody knows that, but we need to know what the manager wants. Then you can work back from that, and you can be like, right, okay, well, this player X hasn't got the aerobic capacity to deal with repeated sprints as a fullback. So we need to improve that player's aerobic capacity. Obviously, you do it collectively as a whole and get everyone up to a baseline. Then you look at individuals, building from there. But unless you know where the manager wants to go, you're it's having a stab in the dark, basically.
And it ties into what Connor said about before as well, isn't it? Because there's a fine margin between getting players injury free throughout that period and getting the right intensity into him, isn't there? And that's where it comes into, I suppose, managing each individual within the squad as well, doesn't it? In terms of people coming back, maybe having different injuries the previous season, obviously different injury histories, but then making sure everyone's ready to go on those first few games.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, you do certain tests, and I'm a big fan of Martin Boucher and his work with the 30-15 test, the intermittent fitness test, and that helps you to individualize running intensities, especially for the first probably 2-3 weeks, and then you're getting into games, you look at more at top ups or add-ons rather than actual condition sessions for the squad. But that helps you to kind of individualize within a squad environment when you're having 3 or 4 running groups based on the test scores from that, rather than just everyone's doing the same run. Here we go, like it used to be. So that definitely does help.
Well, we'll move it on to, and I know this again comes into, you've got to take into the factor that there's other people in control of the preseason period or other inputs in terms of the manager and even logistically with the club and obviously everything that's going on with COVID and restrictions and stuff at the moment. But I wanted to talk about the length of preseason. So if you were literally in charge of that period and you could plan out, we're going to have X amount of weeks, where would you go with it? I know this can be a bit of an open discussion, but I just thought it'd be good for coaches to hear or get into your mindset around how long you'd want for a preseason period. Rob, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I've had this conversation a few times, and I think in terms of having time to work with players, longer is better, essentially. But we haven't got that freedom. So I've spoken to rugby quite a bit, and they've got quite a good way of doing it. So what they do is they have a general prep period, and this is rugby union coaches, veteran leadership coaches spoken to. Their general prep period for like 4 weeks. Or 21 days, just over 21 days. And then they have a little break where the players can go away for like 4 or 5 days. And then they come back into specific prep or more like competitive prep. So I quite like that model where you've got 4 weeks or so to build capacities. You can periodize, you know exactly what's happening rather than games being thrown in here and there. And then within the second block period, then the games start to happen. So you can definitely make players stronger, fitter, more robust within that 4 week period, and then you just sort of topping up and adding on, really, because typically we have 6 weeks, don't we, in football. I'm not sure who decided 6 weeks, but it's always been 6 weeks since I worked in football. But having that extra sort of period, extra 2 weeks added on top of it to help us split it down the middle, and then give the lads a nice little carrot in between where they've got some time to go away with their family. For me, I think that would probably work better.
Do you know of anyone, Rob, that incorporates that in football? Or is that literally just from rugby?
In football, no. I know that some clubs will have like open sessions where you can come in the 2 weeks preceding the start of pre-season training, but they're not compulsory, and you can have, I don't know, like a couple of sessions a week or something like that. But I don't know anyone within football that has done an 8 week pre-season. In fact, I might have heard of, I think I heard Joey Barton when he went into Fleetwood. Somewhere just popped into my head that they came in 2 weeks earlier for pre-season to have an 8 week pre-season. How they structured it, I don't know. Whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. But I just remember hearing it a few seasons ago. But yeah, apart from that, I don't know anyone personally that does an 8 week pre-season. No, everyone's typically 6 weeks.
And I think that's why it's good to have these discussions, isn't it, to challenge the norm a little bit. But then at the same time, if 6 weeks works, then that's fine. And obviously we know that it can be out of our hands. But Connor, what about yourself, mate, in terms of the length of a pre-season period?
Yeah, so I think, like Rob says, on paper, you'd probably say 8 weeks, and you would do like a 4 week split. So you have your general prep, your specific prep. The side to that, which again, I've never been exposed to a football environment in that way or seen it being done. But my concern would be, would players almost burn out in that period? Even though you'd imagine the first 2 weeks of that general prep would be very low load, very gradual, would they still feel like it's been a long season already at that stage? So I quite like the idea of, having that week break in the middle would be nice. Admittedly, I don't know the schedules for rugby union, so I don't know, do they get a longer off season? So therefore they still get a bit of a break before it and then go in. So I'd say, on paper, 8 weeks, but would that actually work? Would players enjoy that? Based on my knowledge of the players, I'd probably say no, that I've worked in. But I said, Robert, I know you guys didn't have any playoffs last season based on the lockdown and stuff. I know we spoke about it potentially doing 8 weeks, so I take it you didn't do it in the end, the 8-week build-up.
We wanted to after lockdown. So obviously players are off for 5 months, and we thought, well, to build capacities, I thought, right, we'll do this 8-week pre-season that I just said, see how it goes. But in terms of money, we got told no, the players, it's going to cost the club too much to do that. So we had to meet in the middle with a 6-week pre-season, unfortunately. But yeah, we did want to do 8 weeks and have that little break in between, but it didn't come off in the end.
Yeah, well, that's already one other reason why 8 weeks might not work. Money, from the club's point of view, there's just so many factors, I guess, that you have to consider. But from a probably physiological perspective, yeah, I would say 8 weeks.
Wits, anything to add on that? What do you think of the 8-week period?
No, I think the boys are on the money really, and like what the lads have said around that sort of, and what we mentioned earlier in that off-season period changing a little bit, whether clubs choose to almost or to bolt on at the end of an off-season a little bit more compulsory work. Maybe it's not a full week or whatever, how it looks, creates that extension of the loading for that general prep potentially. So you get a little bit more control of, post-testing, sort of session 1 post-testing can be probably a little bit more advanced than it would be traditionally if you have no idea of what the lads are coming back like. So I think, and I know that in academy settings will probably be a little bit more structured around that off-season period, because they're trying to get the lads in, especially from that under 16 to under 17, 18 jump. So we come from part-time schoolboy football into full-time scholarship apprenticeship. That jump in load can be quite significant, because towards the back end of their under 16-year academy, they get their decisions relatively early. They're sort of sent away to concentrate on exams, so their training load starts to sort of creep and drop down. So I think, apart from this year, previously that they would finish quite relatively early, so they got a big jump. They probably need to have that longer build-in to make it safe as they progress into sort of full-time football. Yeah, I think that word of an ideal chunk of time is going to be like, I'm watching the Euros now thinking, and even players within our club and within our first team environment, the club are back in testing over the weekend now, and I'm like, players are still like playing, so they're going to go back in and they're going to be needed for that first league game. So their preseason might be 2-3 weeks and what it's going to look like. So I think it's difficult to say, yeah, we want to have an ideal structure, because different clubs are going to have lots of pockets of players who are actually going to be missing from that preseason. So I think the challenge for the practitioners at any level is how to sort of reintegrate them and progress them safely, knowing off the back of what their sort of off-season period is going to look like.
I don't know if you have referenced last year, which we all know was chaotic to say the least, but are there any other lessons that you might take going forward that possibly got you thinking about certain aspects of pre-season, in particular from last year, or not?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say it made me rethink how I structured pre-season, if you like, because we had to go into essentially Saturday, Tuesday, very, very high density of fixtures. I was thinking, and we've had five months off. I thought, how can we progressively overload these players to tolerate 3 games per week in a 6-week pre-season period when they've not done much leading up to it? I mean, they've been doing off-season programs, and obviously we've been tracking them more so since we've been off, through Strava, MapMyRun, that sort of thing. But you don't know exactly what they've been doing, whether they've been doing their strength programs, etc. So it just made me change my approach, really, to try and get more work into the players safely. And actually, I thought it was going to be, we just rolled with it last year. I thought we were going to have injuries, and we didn't have a single injury through pre-season, luckily. So touch wood. So I think we probably will take that approach and go forward with it. And it wasn't nothing. It's nothing revolutionary, really. It was just like we did instead of doing what I used to do was have a hard day on a Tuesday, hard day on a Thursday, moderate Monday, Friday, and an easy day on a Wednesday, so they can recover in between bouts. And all I did was change it around to the more tactical periodization model, where we do like an endurance day on a Monday, a strength or like intensive day on a Tuesday, Wednesday's your recovery day, Thursday's like a bit of a hybrid where you do a bit of both, and Friday's like a more tactical day for the coaches where they can get their points in amongst, and any players that need topping up, you can do that on the Friday. And that seemed to work. Really. I did that for the first 2 weeks of pre-season until games started kicking in, and that was it. That seemed to work quite well. Chuck in a couple of gym sessions on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and that was it. But previously, 2 days a week was the most we sort of overloaded them, and then you add in the game on week 2 if you're doing a 6-week pre-season. So we just added in that extra day to try and get a bit more load through them, and it worked. You'd be actually surprised how much the lads can tolerate.
Anything on that, Wits?
Yeah, I was just thinking about obviously that sort of return post-COVID. So obviously when you're looking at jumping through the hoops, whatever that was, like non-contact, small group, those first stage of training you had to go through, that sort of in and out culture of you arrive at the pitch side, you get your boots on, your training, and you go, those sorts of things. But more specifically, the detail of the sessions we had to deliver, because you're constrained by time, like you only got 60 minutes on pitch or 75 minutes on pitch. Your planning has to be really, really good. Whereas probably pre-COVID or like pre-other sessions, sessions tend to sometimes elongate and just like the volume becomes a little bit bigger because you're just sort of trying to plod along and get stuff done. Whereas like I think because if you've got time constraints, your planning has to be really, really good. And I think maybe reflecting on those smaller sessions, so when you're dealing with 3, 4, 5 players, and that non-contact stimulus, that progressive loading into contact, I think it was really beneficial probably to work alongside the coaches from that stage. Probably quite similar to like a rehab setting that we've been familiar with, where you got like small group work, you're trying to progress them through, especially that non-contact stage. What can you do? How can you create it to be like positionalized, to get the exposure of build up within that small group? So I think some of the sort of the drills and the practices we probably did at that stage last year, obviously we were lucky enough to obviously film them, have the data for them, so we can try and use them when we go back in across the pre-season this time. So I think that from a learning tool was good. And then also I think being creative a little bit with the gym-based stuff, because you might not have had a gym, you might have been pitch-side gym, it might have been shorter blocks in the gym. So having to sort of microdose and get little bits in across the week, it can probably have us transfer into in-season now, or pre-season, in-season, when you're trying to cram stuff in. So just getting little hits, little snippets of the work you want to do. So I think maybe that there's sort of 2 sort of reflections that we can build on and sort of use moving forward.
Connor, I'll get you to jump in on that in a second, but I was just going to add to that in terms of your individual approaches and your philosophies on pre-season. So going before COVID as well, even though COVID has, like we've talked about, made you sort of maybe rethink a few things. Are there anything that stands out for you in terms of your approaches to the pre-season period over your careers and the different roles you've been in so far? Connor, is there anything that sort of springs out to you?
Well, obviously I went from being at Cardiff to then probably Exeter League 2, so a bit more old school perhaps. So without any disrespect, our manager, he liked a lot of isolated running, whereas previously, like under Wits, I know he follows more of a football periodization model. So that was what I was kind of used to, like using small-sided games as conditioning, only really doing any isolated running that was for high-speed purposes. So when I came to Exeter in the first week, manager Matt, who still is now, was saying these runs he likes, What did I think of them? Bear in mind, I did a lot of reading from, I think Rob mentioned it earlier, Martin Boucher, and we're not trying to plug this book, by the way, but it is a good book. But yeah, Martin Boucher, Hit Guide, or Hit Bible, not 100% sure, but just looking at time at VO2 max, being in certain heart rate zones. And to be fair, looking at some of these isolated running drills, just by chatting to him and modifying maybe the volume that we did. So rather than say this is just purely, I'm not going to give the exact details, but say if it was a 30-minute run, we brought it down to maybe 2 12-minute runs or 2 8-minute runs or that in that, if that makes sense. I was able to actually find a way to really easily control the adaptation. So it's, yeah, I would say that's been the biggest change from my point of view of my pre-seasons, going from a football conditioning perspective to isolated running. And that's not to say we don't do any football conditioning, we do. Like, we still follow the principles, going from extensive work, so larger sided games in the first beginning weeks, to then going into more intensive games in the latter. But there's less of a focus of progressing our small sided game minutes and not very much volume of that. But especially in the early weeks, there's a lot of isolated running that we do now. And I personally quite like that, purely just down to the fact it's a lot more work for me than doing a football conditioning, but I quite like it in the fact that, yeah, I've got a lot of control on how much high speed running we can do. So I know what speeds players are running at. I can, again, individualize it, like Rob says, based upon our testing scores. So it actually, that really changed my philosophy on how a pre-season should be done. I definitely came from probably the new school of, it's got to be football conditioning, why are we running? So then, yeah, working with Matt and seeing good gain, really good gains from it. We had a really good first season, which maybe we'll talk about later. But
It's a great point, and that's something I wanted to go on to in a little bit as well, in terms of the impact the manager and the coaches have on your approach as well, because obviously we know that changes with who you're working with. But Rob, do you want to just take that from there, in terms of not necessarily the managers yet, but in terms of your approach? Is there anything that you feel like?
Yeah, so similar to Connor, I mean, as I've come through academy, I think I think when you first come into football, you're happy to be there, really, and you just kind of just add bits on to what the coaches want to do. And as you get your foot in the door a bit more, you have a bit more say, and then people start to listen to you once you build rapport with the coaches. So I've developed that way. So essentially it was just isolated running I was added in. And now I've come sort of full circle where I kind of not control, but guide the coaches into what football-based drills will be appropriate, especially for the first 2 to 3 weeks or 14 to 21 days of pre-season. And it's learning how to manipulate the intensities, the area sizes, and that sort of thing. So before it was just, you can do what you want. I'll just add some running drills alongside. And now it's actually, let's start with lower neuromuscular load-based drills. So I typically keep coaches within, especially for the first week, 6v6 to 8v8, because we know that the demands of them are lower than match outputs, and then progress on as you get through pre-season. So start with them, probably more non-directional possession, because we know as you add direction, the players will press more, the intensity gets higher. And then just slowly increasing intensity by adding the possessions into directional, and then going into your 10v10s or 5v5s, and then progressing that to 1v1s and bits and pieces like that. So that's probably how I've changed, really, is helping the managers manipulate area sizes, meter square per player, that sort of thing, and the actual intensities of each drills, which I've learned from speaking to coaches, reading bits around it, and then clipping each drill that the coaches do, and learning that actually, if you add a goal in or an end zone, the players are going to press more because they're defending their end zone. If you add players in on the side, they don't really high speed run as much because they're passing sideways. So learning that sort of thing and trying to help the coaches and guide the coaches into progressively overloading the players over the first 2 or 3 weeks. That's probably how I've changed most over the last sort of 6 or so years or 7 years I've been in football.
What about yourself, Wes?
I think like a combination really, and a mixture. And I don't know whether we're going to cover it a little bit later, but probably prepared players to utilize a different model sort of in season as well. You mean, so that has to have well, I always try and make it sure it has a knock-on effect when Rob talked about that reverse engineering. So, for example, if you're like over a few years, and I know he was on the podcast a few weeks ago, like Damien Roden's sort of an adaptation of football periodization. So it weren't as step by step as Raymond presents it in the book, but is almost like taking the key principles of those ideas of that progressive game-based conditioning and sort of overload and underload around it, and the sort of the isolated running that he prescribes alongside it. We did that, so I've got experience of running those components over a couple of pre-seasons, and that's can be quite prescriptive. So what Rob's saying around the coaches is that can be quite prescriptive in terms of the games, right? It's free 12 minutes today in this area size, and that's what it is, you know what I mean? And next week we're going to do this, the week after we're going to do this. And what we spoke about earlier, that progressive overload, it's really good for that, because it controls or allows you to provide controls to move forward. One thing I tried to do, implement it when implementing that sort of model, is try and use the data to back that up. So using the GPS data, like Rob's saying, is like categorizing the game. So right, we're on a 3 times 12 minute 10v10 week. What is the intensity of the free blocks? Is it maintained across the free blocks for all the players in certain metrics? Are we warranting the next step? If intensity hasn't been maintained across the free blocks for whatever reason, whether that's fatigue, whether that's player motivation, whatever it would be, try to provide a little bit of more of an objectivity to that model itself. And then also probably of the flip side of the last few seasons, using the tactical periodization model. So how early do you get that principle of those 2 back-to-back conditioning days? So we're looking back of sort of last pre-season is implementing that in place and looking at how you build successfully and efficiently across those 2 consecutive days would be a challenge, really. So they're the sort of the experiences, I would say, of trying to implement different models. So you've got your in-season model of what it's going to look like. How do you implement that back into the pre-season? So, and then also how does that affect the planning modalities that Rob just talked about around, like area size, conversation with coaches, drill design, practice design? I think from a personal perspective, that's obviously where my strengths are from that coaching and performance background, is that I can really say, actually, that's what that player needs in that moment, and sort of look at the technical, tactical demands with the physical and say, that exercise is going to, or that practice is going to really give him bang for your buck in that situation. So I think for succinct planning, is trying to impart that sort of knowledge into the sessions, really.
Brilliant. And then we'll move on to some different approaches under different managers now. And we don't have to name names or name clubs or anything like that. But the way I'm thinking about this is that we might have some coaches that have worked with the same manager. They know that approach inside out. It might not have changed that much across the time at the club, or we might even have people that have not been in roles at clubs. So I thought it'd just be good to pick your brains on some of the different approaches, and maybe just some of the different approaches that have changed your approach then, or made you adapt. And I know Connor's just mentioned about his current club there, going from Cardiff. But if there was anything else, Which do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I think trying to reflect in terms of maybe how many sort of coaches that I've been in positions working alongside. I think whether that's an academy setting or a first team setting, there's always going to be sort of biases around certain elements in season, pre-season. So some like we talked about earlier might be really for mental robustness driven through isolated running, or even not even isolated running, a pitch pace. It might be like away from the training ground, go and do these types of activities. So I think it's really finding a balance of what I spoke about earlier, of that collaboration and understanding what they want from it, and then sort of trying to build your program from a pre-season around that, but obviously holding your key principles that you think is going to be successful. So, and obviously having the ability to sort of stand up and put your point across. Obviously, the boys are probably in a more pressure situation because the managers themselves are in a more pressure situation, so they probably can't afford to waste sessions across the period. It's got to be right. But maybe within a developmental setting like the academy, our development of physical, technical, tactical development doesn't stop when that first league game under 18s and 23s level starts. So it should continue all the way throughout anyway. So I think in terms of changes of personal philosophy and anything that stands out is, I think, similar to what Connor just said, that I think the importance, and there is room for isolated running. And I think because you can get that control element of certain athletic development qualities, certain ticking physiological markers off as you go through, but then also ensuring that that individualization is there, whether that's positional, whether that's based on screening, testing scores like the lads have mentioned previously, are sort of key. So I think it's probably gone full circle. So if I'm speaking to someone now, I would be trying to say, right, what sort of do you want from your pre-season period? And then also devising that sort of integrated approach. So I think if I'm planning a pre-season now, it's going to have some sort of football conditioning element where it's sort of game-based, and practice design is really important. But I'm thinking, actually, I do warrant some time of isolated running that's going to develop sort of mental robustness, but also tick off good quality physical athletic development at the same time.
Rob, anything on that?
Yeah, it depends on. I think I've just worked out. Actually, I'm starting my 10th season in football. I thought it was about 6 or 7, and it's flown by, really, to be honest. But I've been at Donny for 4 seasons now, and I'm now into my 4th manager since I've been here. So actually what's happened typically is a manager's left. So the first 2 managers left during the off-season period. So I basically had to plan pre-season myself, and then hope that the manager was okay with it and just roll with it. And sometimes we haven't even had a manager appointed until the first week of pre-season. And you think sacked, or you might bring someone else in. So you got all that running through your head, really. And then it happened again. That manager that went well. That's pre-season, was probably my best pre-season, actually. And then it happened the next season where the manager left, and then another manager come in halfway through pre-season. And again, you're thinking, are the players fit enough? Are they not fit enough? I don't know what the manager wants. But I think what's changing now in football is you're getting the clubs are having more philosophy, so that they're appointing like a director of football. They're having a style of play they want to play, and then more and more you see in the approach in terms of staff club staff, and the management will come in and change. But like your backroom staff, support staff, physios, your sports science staff, your analysts, they're kind of staying, and you're getting to know the players a bit better. You're getting to know the philosophy a bit better, so you can kind of build your pre-season. You got an idea of where you want to go, really, even if the manager comes in and out. And I think that's what our club is trying to do now at the moment. But yeah, in terms of management and how that affects it massively, because you don't know whether a manager, like Connor said, wants to do some old school running, which I do think has a place, by the way, or they want to let you do the first 2 or 3 weeks. They want them seeing touching the ball. It changes everything, really. So I've gone through managers that do the magic clock where they're doing runs, doing mentally robust runs where they're not timing. They just got a stopwatch in the hand, not even got batteries in it. And they're counting players in, or they've got a whistle where they're blowing the whistle and say, right, you carry on running until this whistle goes. And they're having a conversation with you about what they're doing that evening. And then they blow the whistle, the lads are on the floor and they go in again. But I do think that has a place, going full circle to where I've been planning every individualized running session, every possession, everything, from when the managers weren't in. But yeah, it's gone full circle. Surprisingly, actually, we all worked under a certain manager, I won't say the name, where they did most of the pre-season running, where the magic clock came out, and they were very, very successful. They got promotion, I think, actually, in that season when they did it. But they were doing very, very old school running. But again, it worked. So there's not a right or wrong way for a manager to do it. As long as you get to that end goal at the end of pre-season or the end of the season where you want to be, it's not wrong, really. But yeah, they dictate a lot, the management, obviously, rightly so, because we're just there to support them, but they dictate a lot. So it's changed my approach with every manager.
Connor, what do you think about, in terms of isolated running, do you think, and I'm not saying this should lead the program at all, but do you think players are expecting that, like from sort of previous experiences or their way of thinking about a pre-season period? Is it something that you think they're expecting?
100%. I think, especially at, like, almost at a lower level than these two at League Two, I think it is expected that they're going to work hard. So, for example, week 2 maybe we might do a 120% MAS or IVFT run. And I had one player do it. He was our fittest player. It was individualized to him, but because it didn't make him feel sick, he didn't feel like he was getting the benefits out of it. So that's one of the difficulties I would say that I have to deal with, is that players are expecting to feel sick every time they do a run. And like Rob says, there is a place for it. But no, by no means should every single isolated running session be run till you're sick, or every single isolated run. So, like I said, Matt wanted to do one of these run-ins, but it was all timed. Everything was planned. It wasn't just a random run or random distances. Everything was measured out. It is just purely not with a ball. But yeah, dealing with players who think sometimes they haven't worked hard, because then you maybe do begin to doubt yourself. But I would just say, just back yourself. As long as you're following what you know, what you've read, it typically works out. And nowadays, like I said, Matt's very happy with the runs that I do. I have full control over them. Like I said, I've actually took stuff that he has done, adapted it myself and put it in, and he ends up liking what I've done more. So yeah, I hope I haven't waffled on too much and gone off topic, but yeah, definitely at lower level players think that you have to run to be sick almost every single run, whereas that's not the case, and I would not recommend that. You want your runs to be hard, and you should choose the right times for your runs to be hard. So I would say, if you are going to do a run similar to that, so we do have one run that I would say pushes a player to that edge. I would typically do that with a day off the next day, or 2 days off, so at the end of the week. And as Rob mentioned, neuromuscular strain. So again, I could be going off topic here, I'm really sorry, but ways that I prescribe my work with players is CV load and neuromuscular load. So during the early weeks, I want to target CV, so your heart, your lungs, and my runs are going to be as minimal neuromuscular load as possible. So whether that's through more straight line running, less turns, or having players running in trainers. So that's two ways that's why I like isolated running, because you can manipulate those variables, really.
Brilliant. And then I wanted to talk about your most successful pre-season period so far, and why. The most important thing is why. So why was it a success? Rob, do you want to start us off? I know you might have referenced it a couple of minutes ago, but
so to give people some context to it. So just started in first team football. A manager brought me in halfway through I think it's 2017-2018 season. Calls me just as I'm about to go on holiday, and says he's leaving. All the best. the new manager will come in due course. So I was like, wow. So like, I've just come into first team football. I've been here 6-8 months. Manager's leaving. What am I going to do? Like, I didn't know that the club were quite happy with me then. I didn't know where I stood basically. So there's me frantically trying to plan pre-season. I'm going through it with a fine-tooth comb, trying to get the best out of it I could. Trying to liaise with the coaches that were there, that I knew that were going to be helping out. And it was stressful. It was stressful. We didn't appoint a new manager until the end of, I think it was the end of the first week. So I had to sort of plan everything. And then, the manager came in, saw my plan and thought, yep, okay, I'm happy with that. That seems roughly what I'm going to do, what I want to do. Started wrong with that. We then went away to La Manga in the second week in pre-season, and I was just trying to do as much and look as busy as I could, really, just to try and make him think, right, this guy. I mean, it's not necessarily that you know what you're doing. It's actually he's working hard, so that's what they can see first, and then the proof is in the pudding, really, at the end, if the players are fit for what they want to do. He had a very high press, intense sort of transitional style of play where the players had to be very fit for. So, which I only found out obviously after the first week. So then I tried to push the intensity towards the end of pre-season. And we started well. And then that season we ended up getting to the playoff semi-final. And anecdotally, the manager mentioned this, I didn't, but the team we were playing, a couple of players went down with cramp because it went into extra time. We were fine. I think the physio did give us our lads, I can't remember what you call it, but like you find it naturally in tonic water. Can't remember exactly what it's called now, but anyway, he gave them tablets before that to help the cramp. So I didn't tell the manager that or the board. I just said, that's because they're the fittest team in the league. But then the board commented to me after that. He said, look, we were really fit this season. And to be honest, it's probably down to the way that manager trained and played. But we had no injuries in pre-season, had a good start to the season, then went on to the playoffs. So I think in the situation I was in, where just coming to first team football, I was looking for the manager to guide me a little bit on what they wanted to do, to having to plan a whole pre-season for a first team. And then you got a new manager coming in. That was massive for me, really. And then for it to go well, no injuries, start the season well, end up in the playoffs, I'd say that's probably the best season I've had, or the best pre-season I've had, really. Rightly or wrongly, whether it was the best on paper, it just seemed to work, really. It just seemed to work. So I think the fact that the manager had a high intensity style of training and playing probably helped me towards the end, because I didn't have to do it. He did my work for me within his session. So,
Connor, what about yourself?
So I've got two, really. I'd say, well, I don't know if you count. Obviously, post lockdown, we had the playoffs to prep for. So we literally had 3 weeks to get ready for 3 games. So during that time, I was giving out remote programs to players, putting in countless hours of work on it. I've never really had to do something in that much detail before. There's a lot of detail into it. Obviously, it was based from the first pre-season that I had, which I also it's between those two. My first pre-season at Exeter, or then the mini pre-season that I call it, if it counts the pre-season. It was a 3-week block, but I'm counting it as a pre-season. But yeah, so players were given work off season. I did a few trials or tests before, and was able to predict which players would be on top, and they all came through as I predicted. So that was one good reason behind it. We had 0 injuries in this 3-week block, which probably is just 3 weeks. Maybe that's why players didn't get injured not long enough. But they were then able to play a 90 minutes first game against Colchester away, which we did actually lose. We actually looked a bit sluggish, so I was very worried. But then second game at home, we were absolutely on fire and were able to go into extra time. 0 players had cramp. We didn't take any supplements, although I think Rob did advise me on something like that, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about it, or my doc wasn't sure. I think I did suggest it to the doctor, and he gave me a bit of a look like it's for old people at night, or something. Night cramps is what he told me. So, but luckily enough, yeah, they got through it. So we did end up tanking it at Wembley, but that was hopefully not fitness related. But yeah, that was a real eye opener to me for players to tolerate 120 minutes, whether that's off adrenaline, I don't know. But the fact that I was able to predict who would be the fitter players and those who I suggested typically ended up in the starting team. Yeah, that was a real successful one for me in that regard.
Wits, what about yourself? More successful pre-season period?
No playoff hunting for me, like these boys, but I think probably the boys have sort of highlighted what maybe signified a good pre-season or a positive pre-season. So it probably resonates with me the same across multiple pre-seasons is, are the players robust? So have they sort of got through the period that they're ready to perform to a level and sort of start well in competitive games? Has the manager or the coach or the academy staff been able to implement whatever that developmental philosophy is in their possession? Players being able to spend time individually developing on the areas that they need to work on. I think the only question mark I would probably say is that across that robustness is from a developmental setting is sometimes is keeping everyone really, really available all the time the best thing. I'm probably going to contradict what I said earlier, but I probably could know that I could keep 18 players in a really safe zone across the period of the first 6 to 12, 14 weeks of the season. But is that going to get them closer in our club to the first team or to the 23s, or pushing the ceiling to go and play and be physically dominant enough at Doncaster or at Exeter if they go on loan, for example? So I think it's that sort of trade-off of really, really pushing the players physically and developing them enough, but not having that sort of mindset that, great, we got 100% availability, but actually you haven't really pushed the envelope and pushed them to the edge a little bit. So I think that's probably different. So I think that's what probably warrants to me a successful pre-season, is that all those components are sort of nailed, and you probably feel, whether that's anecdotally or objectively, your markers that you test at pre-season, that testing block 1 and block 2 in season, they're jumping up. They're seeing strength gains, power gains, speed gains, and you really push the development level. So that would probably be a difference to the lads. But I think it's always great that those first couple of games of the season that you, like your boys are saying, you outrun people, they're getting cramped, they're getting other things, because what you talked about earlier is almost buy-in then, isn't it? So your ideas of whatever you signified as being a positive experience probably have a knock-on effect. So what Rob's talking about, right, that situation where he's had to experience of planning and devising the pre-season, manager comes in, says, okay, let's roll with it, it's a success. That relationship is developed then, so they can really build on that moving forward then.
The only thing is, Wits, they only stay for a season and they go, so the relationship's gone. It must be me.
Yeah. I've got to say on that, Witso, as well, when John Goodwin was on the podcast from Fulham, he said the exact same thing to you. He was talking about availability in regards to availability or development, essentially, and what the focus should be at academy level. And he was saying exactly the same. Like, for him, it's a developmental stage, and it isn't just a case of keeping people available throughout that time, is it? They need to progress as well. So yeah, I think anyone that's not listening to that episode, like John had a very similar sort of thought path on that. Lads, we'll just wrap it up with just a few questions. So I'll put out on our social media just about us running the pre-season podcast. And we've had a few questions sent in, so I'm going to throw these at you now. Anyone jump in on these? First one being, someone's just wrote, how to manage load without GPS apart from readiness questionnaires. So I don't know whether this is someone maybe working a semi-pro club, part-time possibly. But what would your approach be for managing loads without GPS?
I'd say if you go from the approach of if you know roughly what you want to do, I'd probably go RPE as an intensity metric, and then time as the volume one, the basic one. So you can look at individual players, and then you can get a team average, and then just plan it as if you kind of. I would start with 6v6, 8v8 for the first week, non-directional to directional. Second week, maybe start introducing some 11v11 smaller area, then increase it. So essentially moderate area sizes to larger area sizes, then to small area sizes. That's how I'd basically and do it. And then if you're working off the intensities of like the mass or the velocity of intermittent fitness test from the 30-15, progressively increase from 85% or 90% up to 110 or whatever you're going to work to. That's how I'd work it. Progressively overload them over the first few weeks.
Perfect. Anyone else on that?
Yeah. So obviously, from a sports science metric, I would say RPE times duration, so session RPE. Then just tracking your minutes. So like Wits would say, like football periodization overload of that. So say session 1, 8v8, you do 3 times 8 minutes. Session 2, you do another 8v8, progress it maybe by a minute, 3 times 9 minutes. That way. I did have someone else, and I just totally forgot what was in my head. Got football conditioning. Oh, what was it? Maybe let Wits answer, and then I'll see if I can think about it again. I'm so sorry.
Anything to add, Wits?
I think it's almost trying to what the guys talked about earlier is almost reverse engineering what you want from it. And I think most practitioners now, or most experienced practitioners from a external load perspective, if they've used it for long enough and they've planned and delivered a certain type of program, it's almost just confirming what you sort of would expect, if you know what I mean. So back to what Rob spoke about earlier around like the lots of the variables of manipulation. I think there's lots of components that can be manipulated. So that's pitch size, block length, number of blocks, bits what Conor was talking then of some sort of progressive conditioning game model of like, this is some objective measure to say, actually, step 4, 3 times 12 minutes, the players subjectively, coaches RP, the boys are cruising it, you know what I mean? So then it gives you a sort of a reasoning to move on. So I would say like if you can get a balance of those nice, what the lads talked about of the probably more scientific subjective measures of wellness, RP load in terms of session duration, and then sort of combining it with the more planning and delivery tools. I think you can sort of create a nice balanced approach. So from an academy setting, only the top age groups obviously have objective data in terms of GPS and those sorts of things. So maybe definitely part of my role in terms of educating the coaches that deliver without the technology is speaking about all those things. So how can you create a progressive training model that's not reliant on numbers, but it's relied on good solid principles of training from a scientific perspective and then also from a integrative perspective.
Has it gone back, Connor?
It has, but I think Wits smashed that one out the park. But yeah, no, mine was from a MAS perspective. It's just knowing your sets and reps on certain runs and then in your distances, and you can kind of gauge it from that way. So I don't know who this question's for, but I wouldn't recommend. So say if you're going by MAS, I'd say in your first week or 2, go no higher than definitely 120% MAS. Maybe then in weeks 3 and 4 you can go to like your 130s, 140s. But no, I think the way Wits described it then was bang on, really.
Brilliant. Well, that's for Eclipse Rehab UK. We've got another one, and I know that you could go into loads of detail on this, but we'll try and keep it as brief as possible. This person has asked about GPS, but I feel like we've sort of covered that in terms of the lack of GPS and your approach. But they've also asked about programming plyos, strength and power in a pre-season period. And I know we could literally probably do another hour or so on that, but how would you give like an all-round answer for that to keep it as brief as possible? Who wants to take that one? No
Yeah,
one.
fine. I'll jump in. Yeah. So I usually block it. So I start with, if you go for strength, I start with typically hypertrophy for probably, if you're doing a 6-week periodization, probably 2 weeks hypertrophy, then you're working into probably strength. Again, it's individualized based on your testing for pre-season, and their training history, but probably hypertrophy, then into strength, and then into maybe some kind of undulating periodization, probably as you get towards the competitive prep. You're dictated by games because the games are going to take over and you're going to have to work around games. So as you get in towards 90 minutes, you're not going to want the players to be sore. So you might do like a microdose or like more of like a isometric approach. That's what I typically do towards the start of the season. Plyos typically will start with foundation based ones, so jump and hold. I normally do that for probably the first week or so to get the landing mechanics, and then work into extensive, so like your repeated jump, ankling, that sort of thing, and then go on to intensive, so like I can never say the word, but the intensive jumps, so like your shock method towards the end of the season. But again, based on your testing, typically I'd have like 3 groups, and some players won't even go into that if their RSI or their reactive strength is too low. They won't go into that. They'll just stay on the extensive based stuff. And then power, plyo power, probably similar really. I'd probably group the power based stuff in terms of like your speed, strength speed stuff into your strength based program. Probably wouldn't do too much of that until week 3-4. And then your plyos just follow on from there, and then the last block probably undulating. That's probably in a nutshell. That's probably how I do it. Obviously, individuals you'll change, and I just try and bucket and group best I can.
Brilliant. Sorry, Connor, do you want to add to that?
Oh, can I or not?
Yeah, go for it.
No, I just say similar to Rob. I would probably say incorporate it all, but you should have different like phases in each. So for your strength, like Rob says, first week isometric, that will tie in quite nicely with like your extensive plyos. So start very easy with that, and don't forget, plyometric wise, I would recommend very low volumes, because on the pitch they're getting a lot of plyometric actions from their changes of direction, their deceleration. I would say, strength is the key focus, because they're typically the sessions with a lot of eccentric loading. They're going to cause a lot of DOMs, but in pre-season that's not as bad. That's not such a bad thing. So main focus would be strength. Don't worry too much about plyometrics and power, because they'll get a lot of stimulus in the early. So if they've not been doing much change direction, much sprint work in the off season, they'll get it all through there. Like, don't forget, sprinting is probably the best plyometric activity you can do. Yeah, focus on strength, in my idea.
We haven't just finally, this isn't really a question. They've just more sent like just topics, I suppose. And one thing we haven't spoke about too much is the screening or testing in the preseason period. And I know, again, we could probably base the whole podcast off it, but someone else has asked, they've just put test application of test results in the practice. So does anyone just want to touch on that just to wrap us up? Which, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so from a testing and screening perspective, obviously, just try and look to cover things that we're going to sort of retest in the season. So don't want to collect any sort of data that's not going to be useful throughout the season. So work with the physios, work with the relevant staff to say, actually, if someone's getting injured, what are the sort of special tests and the sort of markers you're going to look to try and use as a return to play, for example. And then also from a performance marker, what are we going to try and do to assess change of whatever programming we're putting in place, whether that's pitch-based and gym-based. So the boys were talking about earlier, so a simple sort of aerobic assessment to derive sort of maximum aerobic speed would be a good place to start. And then also sort of jump testing. So simple squat jump, counter movement jump, reactive sort of strength. So at the moment, we're sort of running with a 10-5 repeated hop. Some elements of movement screen to assess movement competency, some measures of flexibility, mobility, and then potentially some levels of strength then. So that might be Nord boards, groin bar, handheld dynamometer stuff, maybe an isometric mid-5 pull if we've got the time and really want to do it. So those sort of blocks of strength, competency, mobility, flexibility, and then sort of more of the maybe the pitch-based markers then would be the sort of the go-to. But the key point for me really is don't test for the sake of testing. Test what you're going to look to retest throughout the season, because I've been guilty of it in the past. We actually don't really use that data apart from creating some nice graphs at the start of the season. So test what you're going to retest would be the key points for that.
Class. Lads, I really appreciate that. That was absolutely brilliant. I hope we got through majority of topics around pre-season. I think we've covered quite a bit there. And I really appreciate your time, but also going into your experiences as well. So thank you very much for coming on. Just finally, if people have got questions, if they want to reach out, if they want to get into discussions around maybe your approaches or ask questions around what they're doing, where would you direct them? Are we big on social media? Is it emails, LinkedIn? Where's best? Connor, do you want to go first?
Probably Twitter for me. Yeah, Twitter is my name. If you spell it right, a lot of people spell it wrong. The second name, bit of a difficult one. But yeah, just at me at that if anyone has any questions, or they can have my email, which is is connor.derbidge@ecfc.co.uk. Yeah, that'll be the
Perfect.
Yeah, to answer any questions.
What about yourself, Rob?
First, I want to apologise for my rambling because I probably went off at a tangent on loads of points. I've got loads of stuff written down from your questions you sent over, and I've not ticked off any of it, to be honest. So apologies for littering people's ears. But yeah, I'm not great on social media. I just retweet things that I sort of on Twitter that I sort of come back to look at. But my Twitter handle is @Robbo @ROBBO_Leo LEO. To be honest, I don't know why it's that. It's probably because Rob Lee was taken. It's quite a common name. So that's probably why.
I don't even think I follow that, Rob. I don't even think I follow you on Twitter.
You probably didn't know our Twitter, mate, to be honest.
No.
I searched Rob Lee and I followed every other Rob Lee, I think.
That's probably why, yeah. I don't know. I'm not. That's the only social media I've got. Nothing else. So, and then yeah, email. So my email is rob.lee@clubdoncaster.co.uk. Probably the two best places to get hold of me.
Perfect.
DM me though. I'm going to struggle to get back to you because I've only just worked out how to get onto it on my phone.
Which, what about yourself?
Yeah, similar. So yeah, Twitter maybe, or LinkedIn, or email itself. I think just trying to look now. Andy Witt 24 is my Twitter.
Perfect.
Twitter name, and obviously maybe just message me on there if you need to get an email off me, or find me on LinkedIn. It's sort of the best place really.
Awesome. Well, yeah, lads, we'll put the your Twitter handles and stuff in the show notes anyway, so people have got them. But I just want to say thanks again for coming on. I appreciate you coming on and chatting to me in your evening when you could be doing a million other things. So I really appreciate it, and I hope people have taken plenty from it, because I think there was loads of great information in that one around pre-season. And good luck with the season ahead as well.
Cheers, Ben.
Cheers, Ben. Appreciate that.
I appreciate having us.
Thanks, lads.
Cheers, lads. See you later.
See you later.